What if the person responsible for a series of deaths had already been declared dead? This isn't a riddle from a forgotten novel. It asks the central question of one of the strangest unsolved cases in 19th century English story that begins with a cannonball and ends in a whisper. Our story takes us to 1867, to the quiet, fog-draped town of Port Royal, just a stone's throw from the bustling heart of London. Here, in this seemingly peaceful place, lived Miss Eleanor Apple. At 94 years old, she was less a librarian and more of a monarch, ruling over a vast private library with an iron will. She wasn't respected, she was feared. Her world was one of absolute discipline, a sanctuary of silence and order. For the townspeople, any deviation from her rules was met with a swift and public reckoning. Returning a book even 1 minute late wasn't a minor offense. It was an invitation to be publicly scolded, her sharp voice echoing down the cobblestone streets, a humiliation that lingered long after the words faded. Miss Applebottom was harsh, unforgettable, and impossible to ignore. She was a permanent fixture of Port Royal, as old and unyielding as the stone walls of her library. Then, on April 18th, the impossible happened. Miles away, a military conflict raged, a distant thunder that most of Port Royal paid little mind. But chaos has a long reach. A single stray cannonball, an errant piece of iron and fire, arched across the sky and found its mark. It struck the library. The impact was catastrophic. The old, dry building, filled with paper and dust, caught fire instantly. Flames erupted, climbing the walls with terrifying speed, consuming everything in their path. The fire spread too quickly for any rescue attempt. The town could only watch as Miss Applebottom's fortress of knowledge turned into a blazing pyre. When the last embers died and the smoke finally cleared, only a blackened shell remained. The ashes of thousands of rare books mingled with the ruins, and amidst the devastation, Miss Eleanor Applebottom was officially declared deceased, consumed by the inferno she had so fiercely guarded. For a moment, a strange sense of relief settled over Port Royal. The town's formidable matriarch was gone, but days later, that relief curdled into something else entirely. A new, colder fear began to seep through the town, as thick and persistent as the river fog. One by one, prominent townspeople were found dead. They passed away in their own beds in the dead of night. There were no signs of forced entry. No screams were ever heard. No signs of a struggle. It was as if they had simply stopped living. The local doctor was baffled, citing natural causes, but the pattern was too neat, too disturbing to be a coincidence. Each victim, it was discovered, shared a common history. They had all publicly clashed with Miss Applebottom at some point. There was the merchant who had argued over an unpaid fine, the young couple she had banned for whispering among the shelves, the councilman she had humiliated for daring to suggest her library hours were inconvenient. The list went on. Whispers started to spread through the hushed parlors and shadowy alleyways. People began to talk. Hadn't someone heard strange shoe-filling footsteps near the ruined library late at night? A delivery boy swore he saw a single candle flickering in the hollowed-out window where Miss Applebottom's desk used to be. Others claimed books scorched but miraculously intact had started appearing on the doorsteps of those who still owed fines. A child, too young to understand the town's growing terror, told her mother she saw an old woman standing in the fog near the cemetery gates, holding a heavy ledger and a pen. The description was unmistakable. It was Miss Applebottom. This was the Victorian era, an age torn between scientific reason and a deep-seated belief in the supernatural. The town of Port Royal became a crucible of this conflict. Guilt, a powerful force in the Victorian psyche, began to take hold. Had their secret relief at her death somehow called her back? Was this a form of divine, or perhaps infernal, punishment for their disrespect? The collective paranoia grew with each passing day. Neighbors began to eye each other with suspicion. Was the person living next door secretly carrying out these acts, using the ghost story as a perfect cover? Perhaps it was a relative of Miss Applebottom seeking revenge on her behalf. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something else. A rational explanation felt just out of reach. The deaths were too clean, too silent. How could a human killer operate with such ghostly perfection? The authorities were called in from London, but they faced an impossible, almost laughable question. How do you investigate, let alone accuse someone who is officially dead? Her death certificate was signed. Her remains were presumed to be ashes. To even suggest a vengeful spirit was responsible was to invite ridicule from the modern, scientific minds in the city. Yet, back in Port Royal, The fear was real. The investigators interviewed dozens of people, but all they gathered were ghost stories and fearful glances. There was no physical evidence, no witnesses to a living perpetrator, nothing to ground the case in reality. Faced with a dead end and the risk of inciting a wider panic, the officials made a decision. The investigation was quietly buried. The official reports were sealed, and the deaths were recorded as unfortunate but unrelated natural events. The story of the avenging librarian of Port Royal was pushed into the shadows, becoming a local legend, a tale to frighten children. And then, just as suddenly as they had begun, the deaths stopped. No more silent passings in the night, no more scorched books on doorsteps. The nighttime footsteps faded, and the fog seemed to lift both literally and figuratively. Port Royal slowly returned to a semblance of normality, though the memory of that strange, terrifying spring never truly left. The ruins of the library stood for years, a dark monument to the mystery, until they were finally cleared away to make room for new buildings, burying the last physical trace of the story. So what truly happened in that small town? Was Miss Eleanor Applebottom a force of pure will, a vengeful spirit so consumed by her life's work that not even death could stop her from balancing her ledgers? Or is the truth something more psychological? Did the town of Port Royal, weighed down by its collective guilt and fear of a woman they had scorned, create a monster out of its own paranoia? Did one of their own become a phantom killer, hiding behind a ghost story that everyone was all too willing to believe? The case remains unsolved, a footnote in the dusty archives of Victorian crime. It leaves us with a chilling question that hangs in the air like smoke. Was Miss Applebottom a vengeful force beyond death, or did Port Royal create a monster out of its own fear? Some libraries close forever. Others never stop keeping score.